As the investigation developed and thousands of leads were followed to dead ends, the broad field of possible suspects gradually began to narrow. Among the early suspects was Anthony Pino, an alien who had been a principal suspect in numerous major robberies and burglaries in Massachusetts. Pino was known in the underworld as an excellent caseman, and it was said that the casing of the Brink's offices bore his trademark. Pino had been questioned as to his whereabouts on the evening of January 17, 1950, and he provided a good alibi. The alibi, in fact, was almost too good. Pino had been at his home in the Roxbury section of Boston until approximately 7 p.m. Then he walked to the nearby liquor store of Joseph McGinnis. Subsequently, he engaged in a conversation with McGinnis and a Boston police officer. The officer verified the meeting. The alibi was strong but not conclusive. The police officer said he had been talking to McGinnis first, and Pino arrived later to join them. The trip from the liquor store in Roxbury to the Brink's offices could be made in about 15 minutes. Pino could have been at McGinnis's liquor store shortly after 7:30 p.m. on January 17, 1950, and still have participated in the robbery. And what of McGinnis himself? Commonly regarded as a dominant figure in the Boston underworld, McGinnis previously had been convicted of robbery and narcotics violations. Underworld sources described him as fully capable of planning and executing the Brink's robbery. He, too, had left his home shortly before 7 p.m. on the night of the robbery and met the Boston police officer soon thereafter. If local hoodlums were involved, it was difficult to believe that McGinnis could be as ignorant of the crime as he claimed. Neither Pino nor McGinnis was known to be the type of hoodlum who would undertake so potentially dangerous a crime without the best strong-arm support available. Two of the prime suspects whose nerve and gun-handling experience suited them for the Brink's robbery were Joseph James O'Keefe and Stanley Albert Gucciora. O'Keefe and Gucciora reportedly had worked together on a number of occasions. Both had served prison sentences, and both were well known to underworld figures on the East Coast. O'Keefe's reputation for nerve was legendary. Reports had been received alleging that he had held up several gamblers in the Boston area and had been involved in shakedowns of bookies. Like Gucciora, O'Keefe was known to have associated with Pino prior to Brink's robbery. Both of these strong-arm suspects had been questioned by Boston authorities following the robbery. Neither had too convincing an alibi. O'Keefe claimed that he left his hotel room in Boston at approximately 7 p.m. on January 17, 1950. Following the robbery, authorities attempted unsuccessfully to locate him at the hotel. His explanation: he had been drinking at a bar in Boston. Gucciora also claimed to have been drinking that evening. The families of O'Keefe and Gucciora resided in the vicinity of Stoughton, Massachusetts. When the pieces of the 1949 green Ford stake body truck were found at the dump in Stoughton on March 4, 1950, additional emphasis was placed on the investigations concerning them. Local officers searched their homes, but no evidence linking them with the truck or the robbery was found. In April 1950, the FBI received information indicating that part of the Brink's loot was hidden in the home of a relative of O'Keefe in Boston. A federal search warrant was obtained, and the home was searched by agents on April 27, 1950. Several $100s were found hidden in the house, but could not be identified as part of the loot. On June 2, 1950, O'Keefe and Gucciora left Boston by automobile for the alleged purpose of visiting the grave of Gucciora's brother in Missouri. Apparently, they had planned a leisurely trip with an abundance of extracurricular activities. On June 12, 1950, they were arrested at Towanda, Pennsylvania, and guns and clothing that were the loot from burglaries at Kane and Coudersport, Pennsylvania, were found in their possession. Following their arrests, a former bondsman in Boston made frequent trips to Towanda in an unsuccessful effort to secure their release on bail. On September 8, 1950, O'Keefe was sentenced to 3 years in the Bradford County Jail at Towanda and fined $3,000 for violation of the Uniform Firearms Act. Although Gucciora was acquitted of the charges against him in Towanda, he was removed to McKean County, Pennsylvania, to stand trial for burglary, larceny, and receiving stolen goods. On October 11, 1950, Gusciora was sentenced to serve from 5 to 20 years in the Western Pennsylvania Penitentiary at Pittsburgh. Even after these convictions, O'Keefe and Gusciora continued to seek their release. Between 1950 and 1954, the underworld occasionally rumbled with rumors that pressure was being exerted upon Boston hoodlums to contribute money for these criminals' legal fight against the charges in Pennsylvania. The names of Pino, McGinnis, Adolph, Jazz, Maffey, and Henry Baker were frequently mentioned in these rumors, and it was said that they had been with O'Keefe on the big job. Despite the lack of evidence and witnesses upon which court proceedings could be based, as the investigation progressed, there was little doubt that O'Keefe had been one of the central figures in the Brink's robbery. Pino also was linked with the robbery, and there was every reason to suspect that O'Keefe felt Pino was turning his back on him now that O'Keefe was in jail. Both O'Keefe and Gusciora had been interviewed on several occasions concerning the Brink's robbery, but they had claimed complete ignorance, in the hope that a wide breach might have developed between the two criminals who were in jail in Pennsylvania and the gang members who were enjoying the luxuries of a free life in Massachusetts. FBI agents again visited Gusciora and O'Keefe. Even in their jail cells, however, they showed no respect for law enforcement. In pursuing the underworld rumors concerning the principal suspects in the Brink's case, the FBI succeeded in identifying more probable members of the gang. There was Adolph Jazz Maffey, one of the hoodlums who allegedly was being pressured to contribute money for the legal battle of O'Keefe and Gusciora against Pennsylvania authorities. He had been questioned concerning his whereabouts on January 17, 1950, and he was unable to provide any specific account of where he had been. Henry Baker, another veteran criminal who was rumored to be kicking into the Pennsylvania Defense Fund, had spent a number of years of his adult life in prison. He had been released on parole from the Norfolk, Massachusetts prison colony on August 22, 1949, only 5 months before the robbery. At the prison colony, Baker was serving 2 concurrent terms of 4 to 10 years, imposed in 1944 for breaking and entering and larceny, and for possession of burglar tools. At the time of Baker's release in 1949, Pino was on hand to drive him back to Boston. Questioned by Boston police on the day following the robbery, Baker claimed that he had eaten dinner with his family on the evening of January 17, 1950, and then left home at about 7 p.m. to walk around the neighborhood for about 2 hours. Since he claimed to have met no one and to have stopped nowhere during his walk, he actually could have been doing anything on the night of the crime. Prominent among the other strong suspects was Vincent James Costa, brother-in-law of Pino. Costa was associated with Pino in the operation of a motor terminal and a lottery in Boston. He had been convicted of armed robbery in 1940 and served several months in the Massachusetts State Reformatory and the Norfolk, Massachusetts prison colony. Costa claimed that after working at the motor terminal until approximately 5 p.m. on January 17, 1950, he had gone home to eat dinner. Then at approximately 7 p.m., he left to return to the terminal and worked until about 9 p.m. The FBI's analysis of the alibis offered by the suspects showed that the hour of 7 p.m. on January 17, 1950, was frequently mentioned. O'Keefe had left his hotel at approximately 7 p.m. Pino, and Baker separately decided to go out at 7 p.m. Costa started back to the motor terminal at about 7 p.m. Other principal suspects were not able to provide very convincing accounts of their activities that evening. Since the robbery had taken place between approximately 7:10 and 7:27 p.m., it was quite probable that a gang, as well drilled as the Brink's robbers obviously were, would have arranged to rendezvous at a specific time. By fixing this time as close as possible to the minute at which the robbery was to begin, the robbers would have alibis to cover their activities up to the final moment. Born in Italy in 1907, Pino was a young child when he entered the United States, but he never became a naturalized citizen. Due to his criminal record, the Immigration and Naturalization Service instituted proceedings in 1941 to deport him. This occurred while he was in the state prison at Charlestown, Massachusetts, serving sentences for breaking and entering with intent to commit a felony and for having burglar tools in his possession. In September 1949, Pino's efforts to evade deportation met with success. He was granted a full pardon by the acting governor of Massachusetts. The pardon meant that his record no longer contained the second conviction. Thus, the Immigration and Naturalization Service no longer had grounds to deport him. Returning to Pennsylvania in February 1954 to stand trial, O'Keefe was found guilty of burglary by the state court in McKean County on March 4, 1954. An appeal was promptly noted, and he was released on $15,000 bond. O'Keefe immediately returned to Boston to await the results of the appeal. Within 2 months of his return, another member of the gang suffered a legal setback. Jazz Maffey was convicted of federal income tax evasion and began serving a 9-month sentence in the federal penitentiary at Danbury, Connecticut in June 1954. Underworld rumors alleged that Maffey and Henry Baker were high on O'Keefe's list because they had beaten him out of a large amount of money. If Baker heard these rumors, he did not wait around very long to see whether they were true. Soon after O'Keefe's return in March 1954, Baker and his wife left Boston on a vacation. O'Keefe paid his respects to other members of the Brink's gang in Boston on several occasions in the spring of 1954, and it was obvious to the agents handling the investigation that he was trying to solicit money. He was so cold and persistent in these dealings with his co-conspirators that the agents hoped he might be attempting to obtain a large sum of money, perhaps his share of the Brink's loot. During these weeks, O'Keefe renewed his association with a Boston racketeer who had actively solicited funds for the defense of O'Keefe and Gusciora in 1950. Soon the underworld rang with startling news concerning this pair. It was reported that on May 18, 1954, O'Keefe and his racketeer associate took Vincent Costa to a hotel room and held him for several $1,000s ransom. Allegedly, other members of the Brink's gang arranged for O'Keefe to be paid a small part of the ransom he demanded, and Costa was released on May 20, 1954. Special agents subsequently interviewed Costa and his wife, Pino and his wife, the racketeer, and O'Keefe. All denied any knowledge of the alleged incident. Nonetheless, several members of the Brink's gang were visibly shaken and appeared to be abnormally worried during the latter part of May and early in June 1954. 2 weeks of comparative quiet in the gang members' lives were shattered on June 5, 1954, when an attempt was made on O'Keefe's life. The Boston underworld rumbled with reports that an automobile had pulled alongside O'Keefe's car in Dorchester, Massachusetts, during the early morning hours of June 5th. Apparently suspicious, O'Keefe crouched low in the front seat of his car as the would-be assassins fired bullets that pierced the windshield. A second shooting incident occurred on the morning of June 14, 1954, in Dorchester, Massachusetts, when O'Keefe and his racketeer friend paid a visit to Baker. By this time, Baker was suffering from a bad case of nerves. Allegedly, he pulled a gun on O'Keefe. Several shots were exchanged by the two men, but none of the bullets found their mark. Baker fled, and the brief meeting adjourned. A third attempt on O'Keefe's life was made on June 16, 1954. This incident also took place in Dorchester and involved the firing of more than 30 shots. O'Keefe was wounded in the wrist and chest, but again he managed to escape with his life. Police who arrived to investigate found a large amount of blood, a man's shattered wristwatch, and a .45 caliber pistol at the scene. 5 bullets which had missed their mark were found in a building nearby. After being wounded on June 16th, O'Keefe disappeared. On August 1st, 1954, he was arrested at Leicester, Massachusetts, and turned over to the Boston police, who held him for violating probation on a gun-carrying charge. O'Keefe was sentenced on August 5, 1954, to serve 27 months in prison. As a protective measure, he was incarcerated in the Hampton County Jail at Springfield, Massachusetts, rather than the Suffolk County Jail in Boston. O'Keefe's racketeer associate, who allegedly had assisted him in holding Costa for ransom and was present during the shooting scrape between O'Keefe and Baker, disappeared on August 3, 1954. The missing racketeer's automobile was found near his home. His whereabouts remain a mystery. Underworld figures in Boston have generally speculated that the racketeer was killed because of his association with O'Keefe. Despite the fact that substantial amounts of money were being spent by members of the Robbery gang during 1954 in defending themselves against legal proceedings alone, the year ended without the location of any bills identifiable as part of the Brink's loot. In addition, although violent dissension had developed within the gang, there still was no indication that any of the men were ready to talk. Based on the available information, however, the FBI felt that O'Keefe's disgust was reaching the point where it was possible he would turn against his Confederates. During an interview with him in the jail in Springfield, Massachusetts, in October 1954, special agents found that the plight of the missing Boston racketeer was weighing on O'Keefe's mind. In December 1954, he indicated to the agents that Pino could look for rough treatment if he, O'Keefe, again was released. From his cell in Springfield, O'Keefe wrote bitter letters to members of the Brink's gang and persisted in his demands for money. The conviction for burglary in McKean County, Pennsylvania, still hung over his head, and legal fees remained to be paid. During 1955, O'Keefe carefully pondered his position. It appeared to him that he would spend his remaining days in prison while his co-conspirators would have many years to enjoy the luxuries of life. Even if released, he thought his days were numbered. There had been 3 attempts on his life in June 1954, and his frustrated assassins undoubtedly were waiting for him to return to Boston. 2 days after Christmas of 1955, FBI agents paid another visit to O'Keefe. After a period of hostility, he began to display a friendly attitude. Interviewed again on December 28, 1955, he talked somewhat more freely, and it was obvious that the agents were gradually winning his respect and confidence. At 4:20 p.m. on January 6, 1956, O'Keefe made the final decision. He was through with Pino, Baker, McGinnis, Maffei, and the other Brink's conspirators who had turned against him. "All right," he told 2 FBI agents. "What do you want to know?" In a series of interviews during the succeeding days, O'Keefe related the full story of the Brink's robbery. After each interview, FBI agents worked feverishly into the night checking all parts of his story, which were subject to verification. Many of the details had previously been obtained during the intense 6-year investigation. Other information provided by O'Keefe helped to fill the gaps which still existed. The following is a brief account of the data which O'Keefe provided the special agents in January 1956. Although basically the brainchild of Pino, the Brink's robbery was the product of the combined thought and criminal experience of men who had known each other for many years. Serious consideration originally had been given to robbing Brink's in 1947, when Brink's was located on Federal Street in Boston. At that time, Pino approached O'Keefe and asked if he wanted to be in on the score. His close associate, Stanley Gusiora, had previously been recruited, and O'Keefe agreed to take part. The gang at that time included all of the participants in the January 17, 1950, robbery except Henry Baker. Their plan was to enter the Brink's building and take a truck containing payrolls. Many problems and dangers were involved in such a robbery, and the plans never crystallized. In December 1948, Brink's moved from Federal Street to 165 Prince Street in Boston. Almost immediately, the gang began laying new plans. The roofs of buildings on Prince and Snow Hill Streets soon were alive with inconspicuous activity as the gang looked for the most advantageous sites from which to observe what transpired inside Brink's offices. Binoculars were used in this phase of the casing operation. Before the robbery was carried out, all of the participants were well acquainted with the Brink's premises. Each of them had surreptitiously entered the premises on several occasions after the employees had left for the day. During their forays inside the building, members of the gang took the lock cylinders from 5 doors, including the one opening onto Prince Street. While some gang members remained in the building to ensure that no one detected the operation, other members quickly obtained keys to fit the locks. Then the lock cylinders were replaced. Each of the 5 lock cylinders was taken on a separate occasion. The removal of the lock cylinder from the outside door involved the greatest risk of detection. A passerby might notice that it was missing. Accordingly, another lock cylinder was installed until the original one was returned. Inside the building, the gang members carefully studied all available information concerning Brink's schedules and shipments. The casing operation was so thorough that the criminals could determine the type of activity taking place in the Brink's offices by observing the lights inside the building, and they knew the number of personnel on duty at various hours of the day. Considerable thought was given to every detail. When the robbers decided that they needed a truck, it was resolved that a new one must be stolen, because a used truck might have distinguishing marks and possibly would not be in perfect running condition. Shortly thereafter, during the first week of November, a 1949 green Ford stake body truck was reported missing by a car dealer in Boston. During November and December 1949, the approach to the Brink's building and the flight over the getaway route were practiced to perfection. The month preceding January 17, 1950, witnessed approximately a half-dozen approaches to Brink's. None of these materialized because the gang did not consider the conditions to be favorable. During these approaches, Costa, equipped with a flashlight for signaling the other men, was stationed on the roof of a tenement building on Prince Street, overlooking Brink's. From this lookout post, Costa was in a position to determine better than the men below whether conditions inside the building were favorable to the robbers. The last false approach took place on January 16, 1950, the night before the robbery. At approximately 7 p.m. on January 17, 1950, members of the gang met in the Roxbury section of Boston and entered the rear of the Ford stake body truck. Banfield, the driver, was alone in the front. In the back were Pino, O'Keefe, Baker, Faherty, Maffey, Gusciora, Michael Vincent Geegan, and Thomas Francis Richardson. During the trip from Roxbury, Pino distributed Navy-type peacoats and chauffeur's caps to the other 7 men in the rear of the truck. Each man also was given a pistol and a Halloween-type mask. Each carried a pair of gloves. O'Keefe wore crepe-soled shoes to muffle his footsteps. The others wore rubbers. As the truck drove past the Brink's offices, the robbers noted that the lights were out on the Prince Street side of the building. This was in their favor. After continuing up the street to the end of the playground which adjoined the Brink's building, the truck stopped. All but Pino and Banfield stepped out and proceeded into the playground to await Costa's signal. After receiving the go-ahead signal from Costa, the 7 armed men walked to the Prince Street entrance of Brink's. Using the outside door key they had previously obtained, the men quickly entered and donned their masks. The other keys in their possession enabled them to proceed to the second floor, where they took the 5 Brink's employees by surprise. When the employees were securely bound and gagged, the robbers began looting the premises. During this operation, a pair of glasses belonging to one of the employees was unconsciously scooped up with other items and stuffed into a bag of loot. As this bag was being emptied later that evening, the glasses were discovered and destroyed by the gang. The robbers' carefully planned routine inside Brink's was interrupted only when the attendant in the adjoining Brink's garage sounded the buzzer. Before the robbers could take him prisoner, the garage attendant walked away. Although the attendant did not suspect that the robbery was taking place, this incident caused the criminals to move more swiftly. Before fleeing with the bags of loot, the 7 armed men attempted to open a metal box containing the payroll of the General Electric Company. They had brought no tools with them, however, and they were unsuccessful. Immediately upon leaving, the gang loaded the loot into the truck that was parked on Prince Street near the door. As the truck sped away with 9 members of the gang, and Costa departed in the stolen Ford sedan, the Brink's employees worked themselves free and reported the crime. The gang members who remained at the house of Maffey's parents soon dispersed to establish alibis for themselves. Before they left, however, approximately $380,000 was placed in a coal hamper and removed by Baker for security reasons. Pino, Richardson, and Costa each took $20,000, and this was noted on a score sheet. On the night of January 18, 1950, O'Keefe and Gusiora received $100,000 each from the robbery loot. They put the entire $200,000 in the trunk of O'Keefe's automobile. Subsequently, O'Keefe left his car and the $200,000 in a garage on Blue Hill Avenue in Boston. During the period immediately following the Brink's robbery, the heat was on O'Keefe and Gusiora. Thus, when he and Gusiora were taken into custody by state authorities during the latter part of January 1950, O'Keefe got word to McGinnis to recover his car and the $200,000 that it contained. A few weeks later, O'Keefe retrieved his share of the loot. It was given to him in a suitcase that was transferred to his car from an automobile occupied by McGinnis and Banfield. Later, when he counted the money, he found that the suitcase contained $98,000. He had been shortchanged $2,000. O'Keefe had no place to keep so large a sum of money. He told the interviewing agents that he trusted Maffey so implicitly that he gave the money to him for safekeeping. Except for $5,000 that he took before placing the loot in Maffey's care, O'Keefe angrily stated he was never to see his share of the Brink's money again. While Maffey claimed that part of the money had been stolen from its hiding place and that the remainder had been spent in financing O'Keefe's legal defense in Pennsylvania, other gang members accused Maffey of blowing the money O'Keefe had entrusted to his care. O'Keefe was bitter about a number of matters. First, there was the money. Then there was the fact that so much dead wood was included. McGinnis, Banfield, Costa, and Pino were not in the building when the robbery took place. O'Keefe was enraged that the pieces of the stolen Ford truck had been placed on the dump near his home, and he generally regretted having become associated at all with several members of the gang. Before the robbery was committed, the participants had agreed that if anyone muffed, he would be taken care of. O'Keefe felt that most of the gang members had muffed. Talking to the FBI was his way of taking care of them all. 6 members of the gang, Baker, Costa, Geegan, Maffey, McGinnis, and Pino, were arrested by FBI agents on January 12, 1956. They were held in lieu of bail, which for each man amounted to more than $100,000. 3 of the remaining 5 gang members were previously accounted for, O'Keefe and Gusiora being in prison on other charges and Banfield being dead. Faherty and Richardson fled to avoid apprehension, and subsequently were placed on the list of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. Their success in evading arrest ended abruptly on May 16, 1956, when FBI agents raided the apartment in which they were hiding in Dorchester, Massachusetts.